and also talking about them, like what I think what we're seeing in real time related to Charlie Kirk, Nick Fuentes, the right. Like, I feel like that's Trump, as you mentioned, now almost a decade ago. These are subconscious forces that are driving a lot. And there was a point in there that y'all talked about, if the subconscious becomes conscious, that's when it gets very dangerous. And I was wanting you to kind of parse some of that.
Oh, that's a big one. That's very important and very defines our moment a lot. Yeah, it definitely going to school and going into spaces, having a sense of what's important is a really great gift, because you can miss finding that band, you can miss finding those people, and then they're not there, right, in your life. So I think it's just really, it's quite a gift to have that kind of intuition or that sense. So, and I was blessed to kind of grow up with people that gave me that. Certainly also, I was, very good friends with a man named Bernard Hankins, who I think is, the greatest spoken word poet I've ever heard. Him, it's just extraordinary. And we talked a whole lot about like cypher, hip hop, sort of this way of thinking that's improvisation based versus the verification, the certification, and thinking kind of that gap between those different. That was a big impact on me as well. And I think also what's very interesting is if you're not trained in that way of thinking that's more improvisational, the ability to go into a conversation and not know what you're going to say, but also not be nervous the entire time. These are all actually practices that help you deal with the subconscious when it shows up, that if you don't have and you're not ready for, it can destroy you because it overwhelms you and you're destroyed, right? So we've actually not generally in culture had the institutions to think and to hold ourselves in a world where we're prepared for the unexpected. Actually, the mature person plans away the unexpected. And this has set us up to be unprepared for Fuentes and Nick and Trump and all these people, because they represent basically subconscious forces, ultimately, that are not addressed. The libidinal, the theopolitical, the thing we didn't want to look at, et cetera, so forth. You mentioned before also bypassing. Basically, we've done that on the political. The socio-political is full of bypassing, and that doesn't work. You pay a price, baby. It eventually comes back around. So a way I think about to kind of look at the tension of the moment, the main thinker of belonging, again, is a man named Philip Reef. He wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic that I'm very fortunate that Vincent Zemin said, you should read this book. So Vincent, thank you, because I wouldn't have read it without you, baby. And basically, to put a very good, to simplify the argument, is Philip Reef says that human beings require givens and releases. They require things they don't have to question. But then if they question nothing, they're slaves and they're oppressed. So they need releases. Now, what he was concerned about in the 60s and 70s was this basically anything that was a constraint, as he called it, or a given, as I call it, was seen as oppressive and bad. Like if you were told, you need to, you need to go to church because it's good for you. And you would say, well, I don't want to. Therefore, and you would say, well, therefore it is bad. I should be released from that. And there was, deconstruction, right? That any givens, gender, any of that people talk about now, those would be constraints. And the assumption was the triumph of the therapeutic, which is basically getting rid of all repression, pure release, would be freedom. That freedom was found from the removal of all repression, right? Well, actually what ends up happening that Philip Reef talks about is that when you introduce the human subject to no constraint whatsoever, they go crazy. It turns out that freedom destroys us. We can't handle freedom, actually. We don't like freedom. It overwhelms us. Because if I say to you, Christian, you can do X and Y, what do you want to do? Well, you actually can get very nervous because what does choosing X say about me? And what is Daniel going to think if I do X instead of Y? And I don't even know why I want to do X instead of Y. I'll put it off till tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow, right? We don't actually like freedom very much because we don't like being seen in light of what we do with our freedom. And also, if your neighbor, parents know about this real well, if your neighbor raises their children different than you raise your children, or they have a different view of screen time or discipline or eating or whatever, then you question yourself. You're like, well, how do I know that I'm doing it right? What if I'm doing it wrong? What if I'm setting my child up for failure? Right? Like that's one of the great tensions of modern society is it's no longer given that your neighbor is going to generally be similar from you. Well, what other people choose impact what your choices mean to you. The libertarian mistake is basically what all the sociologists were warning, is that individuals in isolation making free choices do impact the choices of their neighbor, because it impacts how they psychologically relate to their own choices. They become more uncertain about them. They become more anxious. And when people are anxious, they tend to blow up. They tend to be miserable. They tend to get bored. The main thing that people do is isolate. The way you deal with the feeling of questioning your own choices in light of the neighbor who chooses differently is not to hang out with your neighbor. And that's where people I think Bowling Alone, Putman, a lot of his ideas on the loss of social capital, I think that's all very good. It's very true that we no longer invest in social capital. But why don't we invest in social capital? Because we actually don't like running into people who are different from us that make us question everything. It lost priority, right? Because of the anxiety. And this is why, too, the temptation to restore community is tied to ideological purity, the removal of the other, because you're trying to recreate psychological stability. And unfortunately, the reason why we wrote Belonging Again is because, people are going to get their belonging. The question is, are they going to get it in a way that isolates and removes diversity, or are we going to find belonging in a new way that doesn't? So, because Nick and all of the post-liberal forces, as I would call them, are basically efforts to restore belonging, to regain belonging. Unfortunately, this belonging is recreating the conditions of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, the unquestioning closed-mindedness, where you just do what we do and you don't question it. And when you don't question things, you can become a force of evil and not even know it. So here's the other issue. So if you get rid of givens and you release everyone, they tend to be overwhelmed by their anxiety and either they tend to, in that condition, turn to a strong man. Okay, like they go to a strong man to restore stability, or they isolate. There's a growing trend of global hikimorism, like in Japan, where people don't leave their apartment. That's growing, and that's only incels. All of that is just often a recapitulation of that. The way you deal with the anxiety of otherness is isolation, hikimorism, which technology increasingly allows you to do. And if the other makes you anxious, isn't it rational to avoid them? Wouldn't that be the smart thing to do? Oh, dang, I guess we need to tie rationality to a moral vision. Well, we don't believe in moral visions because we don't have first principles. Well, then it's rational to isolate. Like hell's rational. That's the problem. Like it's really rational to lock yourself from the inside because you have to deal with those people that make you anxious. So you get rid of givens, you release people, and they isolate people. We think that if you release people, they go off into the wild and explore diversity. Nah, they isolate. And if they do travel, they treat the places they go like a barbarian, getting their experiences, but not honoring the roots of wherever they visit. Like modern tourism is kind of, there's one Italian philosopher who says it's like a modern barbaricism where we just visit places, take our experiences, get our fun and leave. And they're just, they serve us versus us honor them. And that's a problem. So release is bad, but here's the other issue though. Pure givenness, where you don't question anything, you just do what you're born into. You're a Christian, you're in a Christian state, you don't question anything. Well, pure givenness is then, it's given that blacks are inferior to whites. It's given that women are inferior to, and you don't think about it, right? So you get the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt describes. Very important. This does not mean the boredom of evil. It means the everydayness of evil. Like, see, her whole idea is that the Nazis, they were like, we're just doing what one does, dang it. This is just what one does. Whites are superior to blacks. Nazis are superior to everyone else. So it becomes banal in the sense of it's not a moral choice. It's just the roboticism. It's just the everydayness. Please.
And that goes back to, I watched Jordan Peterson speak live. I mean, that was the seed of his question for Maps of Meaning was kind of the problem, was this very question of how does evil become banal? I mean, that really was the seed of his search. And so how is it that it becomes given that this is how society is and all these things? And
absolutely.
So,
go ahead. Not to jump on. I'm sorry.
No,
Jordan
keep
Peterson.
going.
So Philip Reef he's thinking Freud, and he's arriving at these conclusions. Jordan Peterson is thinking Jung and arriving at these conclusions. Because chaos and order, these very much map onto givens and releases, right? It's just that Philip Reef is a great Freud scholar, and he's really interested in the civilization and its discontents. But it is not by chance that Jordan Peterson, interested in this problem, which I think is basically the problem that Philip Reef is pointing to, then rose to popularity because he was able to articulate the tragedy And tragedy, as Martha Nussbaum points out, is not a catastrophe. A tragedy is a trade-off of competing goods. Givens are good and releases are good. Choose the proportionality. So here's the other problem. 60-40, 50-50, 30-20, what's the percentage breakdown, right? And what circumstances the breakdown? So maybe I need 80% givens and 20% releases, but another personality type, high in openness or whatever, maybe that's 30-70, right? There's some kind of trade-off between those things, and all of them become different risks. Well, how you make those trade-offs is going to be tied to your education to live discern, your moral vision of reality, your first principles. And basically what we did, you could say this again is the mistake of Francis Fukuyama in the End of History, is basically like, no, you don't need to make those trade-offs because the market is rational. Like people in their self-interest are rational, and we will naturally proportion the most efficient breakdown between givens and releases in circumstances via market forces and collective consciousness and intelligence. Right?
And this is all breaking down in real time. Even something like the merger of Warner Brothers and Netflix feels like people are recognizing like, oh, this is a capitalist force that, in a certain way we would have said we agree with, but it's like, why am I uncomfortable with this happening in front of my eyes? Because it represents, Hollywood is watching the theater, an abstraction of the play, you could say, become even more abstracted and more isolating. Everyone knows that this is a problem, but it's like it can't stop because this is what it's the rational telos of the market, and so for the investors of the board, so that's the rational. So it is it points back to a first principle of something like depravity or something like a human condition that has a broken nature related to it, left to and that's also a part about I don't know if this is exactly the use of the word the givenness, but the relationship towards the ends of history, again, not knowing what that's standing on. Like, oh, we can just like teach history now, not knowing that these I can't remember the moral formation or what the moral vision, not knowing or taking it obviously for granted, or saying that this is obviously the breakdown in the new atheism, that it can exist without it, that we're rational. Sam Harris, we're rational. We can be moral without morality or something like that. Absolutely. And so we are watching this in real time, and it's hard in certain ways, like, having young children thinking about this world that's kind of developing at the same time. But and even the other parts of the conversation you're talking about, well, where do we go? Are we becoming more isolated? And so I jump into this digital space to try to find someone to actually wrestle with these ideas with. And I, in my own life, in this project, that's, something along the lines of like, why has Peugeot had that refrain for a very long time, which was to go to church, like what you can do something to force yourself into uncomfortable community. Because as much as ideological purity people want to pretend can be found in any in a certain ecclesiological body, you are always going to find difference in other. And it's actually important that we remember how to exist, worship, sing, eat with the other. Absolutely.
Well, to me, that also gets into where Cadell emphasizes the crack, the lack, the anxiety. Mm-hmm. You see, the issue is that if you simply disembody, or you don't encounter the other person, and you associate feeling good with making the right decision, then you'll say, I made the right decision. But if you understand that, no, actually the right decision is on the other side of not liking things, then it's like, well, then maybe I should go to church, and maybe I should talk to those people I don't want to talk to. So, but here's the point. What's the rational way to interpret your emotions? Is it rational to interpret your emotions as meaning you shouldn't interact with that person? Or is it rational to interpret your emotion of anxiety as meaning you should interpret with those people, right? What's the rational way to respond to a feeling of disgust or anger or stuff like that, right? Ivan Illich says that the man on the side of the road was disgusting, and the Good Samaritan helped them all the same. So what's the rational way to respond to disgust? Is disgust evidence of needing to get over yourself and interact with the person? Or is disgust evidence that you shouldn't interact with them? Well, here's the problem. Your interpretation of that emotion cannot be quantified by market forces, and in fact is completely contingent upon your moral vision of reality, your religion, and your first principles.
So that just kind of falls back, and this was where Cadell and I both came to in the previous conversation, but it was like something along the lines of this voluntary self-sacrifice, which is, emblematic of something related to the gospel. So it's that message and that idea, and that was where Peterson came to. And it doesn't maybe answer all questions of not knowing maybe as a person why maybe certain suffering might be existing upon you. Sometimes that's like a Job is a little bit more related to faith or something like that, but in another sense of dealing with, like, it is counterintuitive, because that sounds like a little bit of what you're talking about with, like, well, if I'm anxious, my intuition tells me danger, Will Robinson, danger, don't go be around difference or something like that. And so there is an kind of an evolutionary something or another, which of impulse to protect yourself or something like that.